The station Ethon Prime was a cathedral of cold light. It hung in permanent orbit around a violet dwarf star in the outer reach of the Zereth Collective's territories, a spinning ring of steel and pressurized atmosphere that housed just over 50,000 souls. Most of those souls were Zereth, tall, silver-skinned beings with elongated fingers and eyes like polished mercury, a species that had been reaching for the stars long before humanity had invented the wheel. The rest were a scattered assortment of traders, diplomats, researchers, and contracted workers from a dozen other species. Among that scattered assortment, there were 11 humans currently registered as permanent residents of Ethon Prime. Marcus Cole was one of them. He worked the deep night shift, the hours between the third sleep cycle and the first morning alert when the station's long corridors were as empty as anything could be in a place that never truly went dark. He pushed his cart with the quiet efficiency of someone who had made peace with being invisible. He mopped the floors of administrative offices, polished the observation windows in the upper promenade, cleared the waste processors in the research wing, and occasionally fixed small mechanical failures that the day crew had either missed or didn't consider worth their time. He had been doing this for 4 years. He knew every corner of the station, every shortcut, every panel that buzzed slightly when the station's rotation put stress on a particular junction. He knew the station the way you only know a place when you clean it. Intimately, honestly, without the flattery of good lighting and important meetings. He knew almost no one, and almost no one knew him. That was fine. Marcus had learned a long time ago that there was a dignity to being underestimated. It was a kind of armor. His quarters were on Deck 7 of the lower residential ring, a compact space of 3 rooms that smelled faintly of recycled air and the lemon-scented cleaning fluid he was too tired to fully scrub from his hands after each shift. The rooms were not much, but they were clean, and they were his. More importantly, they were theirs, his and the girls'. Sira and Mira were 7 years old. They were twins, identical in the specific and glorious way that twins with different genetic inheritances can sometimes be, perfectly matched in some ways, wildly individual in others. They had their mother's bioluminescent markings, faint constellations of pale gold light along their temples and collarbones that pulsed softly when they were excited or scared or deeply asleep. They had her silver-gray skin and the long, delicate fingers of the Zereth people. But they had Marcus's eyes, deep brown, almost black, warm as the inside of a familiar room. And they had his smile, that slightly uneven, slightly reluctant smile that appeared slowly and meant something when it did. They had been born deaf, both of them, completely and profoundly, with no residual hearing on any frequency that any audiologist from either species had been able to detect. The doctors had described it as a rare genetic mismatch, a crossing of biological signals that sometimes happened when 2 species who were not designed to combine had children anyway. They noted it in their files with the detached interest of people cataloging weather phenomena. Hybrid births were uncommon enough to be academically interesting. Deaf hybrid births were uncommon enough to be filed and forgotten. There was no research being done. There was no support program. There was no community for families like theirs, because families like theirs barely existed, and the ones that did were scattered across systems too far apart to form anything resembling a coalition. Marcus's wife, Ain, had died when the girls were 4. A structural accident in the research section where she worked. A pressure seal that had been flagged for maintenance and not repaired in time. She was there one morning and gone by afternoon, and Marcus had stood in the medical bay holding that specific cold that comes not from temperature, but from the sudden understanding that the world has permanently rearranged itself without your permission. He had taken bereavement leave, come back to work, and kept going. What else was there? The girls needed him. That was a sentence simple enough to organize a life around. The learning center that Sira and Mira attended was called the Ethon Integration Pod, a small educational facility on the mid-deck that had been established years ago to serve children with non-standard learning needs. It was underfunded, understaffed, and slightly chaotic, but it had 2 educators who understood Zirith pressure sign language and made genuine effort. It was for 2 deaf half-human girls on a station that had no particular interest in their existence, something close to a gift. The notice arrived on a Tuesday. Marcus read it standing at the small table in their quarters, still in his work clothes, the girls asleep in the next room. It was short. It was bureaucratic. The integration pod was being dissolved due to a species alignment restructuring of educational resources, effective at the end of the current administrative cycle. Families were thanked for their understanding. No alternative placement was offered. He read it twice, then a third time in case the words rearranged themselves into something else. They did not. He set the screen down on the table and stood very still for a moment. Through the wall, he could hear nothing. His daughters slept in silence, as they always had, as they always would. The station hummed around him with the constant low-frequency vibration of systems working to keep everyone alive. He thought about what a man was supposed to do when an institution decided his children weren't worth the resources. Then he started moving furniture. He worked through most of that night. He cleared the storage alcove at the end of the main room, moved the boxes into his own bedroom, reorganized what he could, discarded what he couldn't. He retrieved a cracked display screen from the recycling bay at work, the kind that was marked for disposal because one quadrant of the display was dead. He rigged it so the 3 functional quadrants could be used as a drawing surface, a writing tablet, a star map. He gathered a collection of components he had saved from broken equipment over the years. Circuit boards he'd stripped of their sharp edges, capacitors in 6 different sizes, wire spools in 3 colors, and arranged them in a flat tray as a counting and sorting tool. He took 2 sheets from the linen cabinet and tacked them to the alcove walls to soften the space. He sat back on his heels and looked at what he had made. It was not a classroom. It was a closet with good intentions. It would have to be enough. In the morning, he sat Sierra and Mira down on their cushions and placed their hands in his. He signed to them in Zirith pressure touch, the language he had spent 3 years learning from archives and recordings, and the patient, stumbling practice of a man teaching himself in stolen hours. And he told them that the learning center was closed, but that learning was not, and that their classroom was here now with him. Sierra considered this for a long moment. Then she raised her hands and signed. Is it a real classroom? Marcus looked at her steadily and signed back. It is if we make it real. Mira, who had been examining the circuit board tray with focused interest, looked up at that and smiled his smile, slow, uneven, meaning something. They started that morning. Mathematics first, using the components as counting pieces. Then writing, tracing letters and Zirith symbols on the cracked display screen with their fingers. Then geography, Marcus drawing the orbital path of Ethon, Prime, and placing it in relation to the 3 nearest inhabited systems, teaching the girls to understand where they were in the universe. In the afternoons, he began something new. He had been thinking about it for weeks, how Zirith, pressure touch signing, and human visual sign language were both complete, sophisticated systems but operated on entirely different principles. Pressure touch was intimate, one pair of hands communicating with another through contact. Human sign was spatial, expressive in open air, readable across a room. Neither was better. They were just different shapes of the same human, or Zirith, need to be understood. Marcus began building bridges between them. He invented paired signs. Each concept got 2 forms, one for pressure touch, one for open air. He drew diagrams. He made cards. He turned it into a game where one girl would sign a word in one system, and the other had to answer in the other. Back and forth, faster and faster until they were laughing with their whole bodies, hands flying, eyes bright with the specific joy of a game that only you and one other person in the universe can play. He didn't know it yet, but he was inventing a language. 3 weeks after the integration pod closed, a Zirith woman named Soraya knocked on his door. She had a son named Alian, 9 years old, with a sensory processing difference that made the standard educational environment overwhelming to the point of shutdown. The collective schools had tried and stopped trying. She had heard, through the quiet gossip of Deck 7, about the human janitor who was running something in his quarters. She asked if Elian could come. Marcus said yes. The week after that, a human couple brought their daughter Pell, 7 years old, who processed language differently and had been failed by every structured system she had encountered. Then came a Zirith-Drini hybrid boy whose parents had simply stopped believing the station's institutions had anything to offer him. Within a month, Marcus was running a school. It occupied the entire main room now, children sitting on cushions and folded blankets, the cracked display screen serving as a shared workspace. The circuit board trays passed from hand to hand. Marcus taught in whatever language each child needed. He taught Sira and Mira in their bridge language. He taught Elian in careful, minimal stimulus Zirith sign. He taught Pell in spoken words paired with physical demonstrations. He adapted, constantly, without complaint, because adaptation was just another word for paying attention. He was sleeping less than 4 hours a night. His body ached in the specific way that belongs to people who are running on purpose instead of rest. But every morning when the children arrived and settled into the hum of actual learning, he felt something in his chest that he didn't have a name for yet. He was beginning to understand that a man could make something out of almost nothing if the reason was strong enough. Then Commander Delris called him in. Delris was the administrative authority for the lower residential decks, a Zirith official with a precise uniform and the manner of someone who enforced rules, because rules were the only thing that had ever made sense to him. He told Marcus, across a very clean desk, that unauthorized gatherings in residential quarters violated the station's habitation codes, that Marcus was not certified to provide education to minors, that the activity would cease immediately or Marcus's housing contract would be reviewed. Marcus listened. He thanked the commander for his time. He walked back to Deck 7. The next morning, the children came. He taught them. Delris sent a formal written warning. Marcus filed it. That night, after the children had gone home and Sira and Mira were asleep, Marcus sat by the viewport with the lights off. The violet star hung in the distance, painting everything in shades of purple and dark. He was tired in a way that went deeper than his body. He was sitting there, not quite asleep and not quite awake, when he heard a small sound. Mira was standing in the doorway. She crossed the room in her bare feet and climbed into the chair beside him, tucking herself under his arm the way she had, since she was small enough to fit entirely under one side of his jacket. She looked out at the star for a while. Then she raised her hands in the bridge language, the one that existed nowhere else in the known universe except between the 4 walls of these rooms and the small group of children who have learned it here. She signed, "You are the loudest person I know, Papa, and you never make a sound." Marcus looked at his daughter, her gold bioluminescent marks pulsing softly in the dark, his own eyes looking back at him from her silver face, and he pressed his lips together and said nothing, because she was right, and because some things are too full to fit inside words. He held her until she fell asleep, then carried her back to bed, tucked the blanket around her and her sister, and stood in the doorway for a moment looking at the two of them, faint lights drifting in the dark, hands loosely touching even in sleep. Then he went back to his chair, opened his lesson notes for the next day, and kept going. High Sovereign Vela of the Zirith Collective was 270 cycles old, and she had not been surprised by anything in a very long time. She had governed an interstellar civilization through 3 economic collapses, 2 border conflicts, and 1 attempted coup that had been resolved with such precise and devastating calm that the Tyranny Code conspirators had reportedly not realized they had failed until they were already in detention. She had outlived 4 successive advisory councils, 2 architectural styles that had swept through the collective's core worlds as fashionable and then become deeply embarrassing, and 1 entire political philosophy that had risen to prominence during her 4th decade of rule and dissolved quietly by her 5th. She was, by any reasonable measure, a person who had seen everything worth seeing, which was why she was bored. She had known she would be bored before the shuttle had even docked. Station inspections followed a grammar as fixed and predictable as a formal prayer. The same well-prepared surfaces, the same rehearsed guides, the same selected citizens deployed like furniture to suggest a thriving community. She had attended enough of them to be able to predict the sequence of rooms within the first 10 minutes of arrival. Commander Delris had met her at the docking port with 15 staff members, all in fresh uniforms, all radiating the specific nervous energy of people who had been rehearsing this moment for weeks. His welcoming address was competent and completely forgettable. The tour began. The command center was impressive and showed her nothing she hadn't seen before. The research wing was the correct temperature and smelled of the correct chemicals. The upper promenade marketplace had been arranged with a care that was almost touching in how transparently it had been curated. Only the most aesthetically pleasing stalls, only the most composed merchants, nothing that suggested the ordinary friction of actual commerce. Vele walked through it all with her hands folded behind her back and her face in the expression her staff privately called the sovereign default, not unfriendly, not engaged, simply there, processing, impossible to read. She was most of the way through the administrative corridor on the mid-ring when the procession stopped. Her lead guard, Torvin, stepped back and spoke quietly to Delris. A maintenance hatch at the corridor junction ahead had malfunctioned. The hydraulic arm was locked in a partially open position, and the angle was wrong. The ceremonial formation of 12 guards in full armor could not pass without abandoning formation, and protocol during an active royal inspection did not permit it. Delris looked as though he might briefly cease to exist from embarrassment. The hatch had been assigned for repair to the night shift maintenance crew 2 days ago. The repair had not been completed. The only viable route was a detour through the lower residential ring on Deck 7. Delris suggested they simply reverse the tour. Vela was already walking. She was not interested in reversing. Deck 7 was different from everything above it. The corridors were narrower. The overhead lights were functional without being decorative. The walls bore the honest record of years of use, not dirt, because someone clearly took care of this place, but age. The small scuffs and patched panels that you couldn't hide without a renovation budget that this deck didn't have. The air recyclers were slightly louder down here. The floor plates had a different resonance under her feet. It was, Vela thought, real in a way the upper decks had been carefully constructed not to be. She walked slowly, her guards arranged as compactly as they could manage in the narrower space. The residents were in lockdown, as the order had specified, all doors closed, the corridor quiet. She looked at the closed doors as she passed them, thinking about the lives behind each one, the station that Delris had not intended for her to see. She was nearly at the junction that would return them to the mid-deck when she stopped. Her hearing, fine-tuned over 2 centuries and 70 years of careful cultivation, caught something. Behind a door on the left side of the corridor, approximately 4 meters ahead, there were children, not crying, not watching entertainment feeds, not the passive ambient sounds of children existing in a space, the restless shuffling, the intermittent noise of boredom. These were the sounds of children engaged, the particular quality of small bodies leaning forward, the rhythm of a room where attention is being paid. She looked at the door. She looked at Delris. Delris looked as though he were calculating how long it would take to die from embarrassment. Vela walked to the door and opened it herself. The room was not large. It had clearly been reorganized to serve a purpose it was not originally designed for, the furniture pushed to the walls, the floor space given over to cushions and children, a cracked display screen serving as a communal workspace. A flat tray of circuit components sat in the center, half-finished calculations arranged in colorful pieces. There were 8 children in the room. They ranged in species and age. 2 of them, a pair of girls with silver-gray skin and bioluminescent markings and warm brown eyes, were seated closest to the front, their hands moving in a signing language that Vela did not recognize. And there was the man. He was human. Medium height, tired in a way that lived in the set of his shoulders rather than just his face. He was kneeling on the floor between the two groups of children, and he had not heard the door open because his entire attention was directed at a Zeroth boy who was working through a spatial reasoning problem using the circuit board pieces, talking the boy through the logic in careful, minimal gesture Zeroth sign, patient and precise. One of the other children saw the queen first. The room went very still. The man looked up. He looked at Vela. He looked at Delris. He looked at the 12 guards in ceremonial armor crowded into the corridor behind them. Then he looked back at the children in his room, settled them with a small, calm gesture, and stood up. He did not bow. It was not defiance. Vela had seen defiance, and this was not it. It was simply that it did not immediately occur to him that bowing was the relevant thing to do. His attention was still on the boy with the circuit pieces. He almost had it, the man said, to no one in particular. Then he seemed to remember himself, and he looked at Vela and said, "I'm sorry. We're in the middle of something." Behind Vela, she heard Delris begin to speak, the words unauthorized and violation already forming themselves at the front of his mouth. She raised one hand, and Delris stopped. She looked at the room, at the handmade tools, at the repurposed display screen, at the children from at least 4 different species sitting together on their cushions with the relaxed alertness of kids who were genuinely, voluntarily paying attention. She looked at the 2 girls with the bioluminescent marks. "These 2, she said to the man. "They are yours?" "Yes," Marcus said. "What language are they signing?" There was a pause. Something crossed his face. Not quite pride, not quite defensiveness, something in between. "It's a bridge language," he said. "Between Zeroth pressure touch and human visual sign. They needed both, so I built a way to use them together." Vela looked at him. "Who certified this language?" "No one," he said. "I made it." The room was very quiet. Vela took 3 steps into the space and stood looking at one of the girls, the one on the left, who looked back at her with complete composure. A child utterly unintimidated by the most powerful person in the Zeroth collective standing 4 feet away. There was something in her eyes, her father's eyes, warm and dark and steady, that Vela recognized. It was the look of someone who had been told more than once that they were not the kind of person who mattered, and had decided, at some fundamental level, not to believe it. Behind her, Delris stepped forward. "Sovereign," he said, his voice carrying the shape of someone about to deliver a prepared case. "This man has been in repeated violation of habitation codes. He has been conducting unauthorized educational gatherings in a residential space. He has no certification. He has ignored formal warnings. This activity directly contravenes the station's regulatory framework, and I have been preparing formal proceedings. What is your name?" Vela said. She was not looking at Delris. She was looking at the man. "Marcus Cole," he said. "And what is your work on this station, Marcus Cole?" "Maintenance," he said. "Night shift. Deck 7 through the mid-ring administrative section." "The hatch," one of Vela's guards murmured quietly. "The one that rerouted our procession." It was on his assignment. The faintest flicker of something passed across Marcus's face. Not guilt, exactly. Something more honest than guilt. "I was building a star map," he said. He gestured toward the display screen, where the orbital mechanics of the violet dwarf system were drawn in careful, color-coded lines. "For the class." "I ran out of time." Vela looked at the star map. It was not a crude drawing. The orbital paths were geometrically accurate. The relative sizes were to scale. The notations along the margins were in 3 languages, human Zeroth, and a third that she identified, after a moment, as the bridge language he had described. She turned to Delris. "You issued formal warnings," she said. "Yes, Sovereign." He ignored them. "What did the children in this room do, in the interim, while you were preparing your proceedings?" Delris blinked. "I don't." "They learned," Vela said. It was not a question. "While you were writing documentation about why learning was not permitted here, these children were learning." The silence that followed had a specific texture, the silence of a man understanding. "Too late," that he had said the wrong things to the wrong person at the wrong moment. Vela looked back at Marcus. The integration pod was dissolved, she said. It was not a question either. Yes, he said. And no alternative placement was offered. No. So you made one. Marcus looked at her for a moment. He looked at the children. At the boy who had been working through spatial reasoning. At the girl with the cognitive delay who was watching all of this with wide, carefully observant eyes. At Sira and Mira sitting straight-backed and still with their hands quiet in their laps. My job, he said, is to make sure my daughters are never invisible. He paused. That's all this is. Them and whoever else needed a place. Vela held his gaze for a long moment. She had met heads of state who spoke with less clarity. She turned to Torvin, her lead guard. I will need this station's chief educational administrator in my meeting room within the hour, she said. And the collective's office for accessibility standards, and documentation on every hybrid status child currently enrolled or not enrolled in educational programming on this station. Torvin began relaying the instructions. Vela turned back to Marcus. Continue your lesson, she said. Then, before he could respond, she looked at the Zirith boy with the circuit pieces and said, in clean, minimal gesture Zirith sign, finish the problem. You were close. The boy stared at her for one stunned moment. Then he looked down at his pieces and began to work. Vela turned and walked back into the corridor. Her entourage scrambled to follow. Delrus did not return to his post on Deck 7. He was reassigned, quietly and without ceremony, to a regulatory compliance office on a station 3 systems away. The formal proceedings he had been preparing were closed without review. 3 days after the royal visit, a notice arrived at Marcus's quarters. He read it at the small table in his main room, the girls doing their morning mathematics around him with the circuit board pieces. The space at the end of Deck 7's main corridor, a storage bay twice the size of his quarters, had been officially designated as a recognized collective learning node, the first classification of its kind in the Zirith Collective's educational framework. The classification included a funding allocation, materials access, and a formal mandate for multi-species accessibility support. The bridge language Marcus had built was to be documented and submitted to the collective's linguistic archive for study. He read the notice 3 times. Then he set it down and went back to watching Mira work through a problem with focused, intent concentration, the faint light along her temples pulsing slowly as she thought. That evening, after dinner, when the light of the violet star was doing something extraordinary through the viewport, turning the whole room shades of purple and warm gold, Sira looked up from the book she was reading and raised her hands. Are we famous now, Papa? Marcus looked at his daughters. At the room they had made into something real. At the table covered in handmade tools and colored components and drawings of star systems and the worn soft edges of the things that had been used and used and used again. He raised his hands. No, he signed. We're just home. Mira smiled, his smile slow and crooked and meaning everything. Outside, the station continued its orbit. The violet star burned. The universe went about its business, vast and mostly indifferent, full of people making something out of almost nothing in small rooms that no one important was supposed to see. And in one of those rooms, a janitor and his daughter sat in the last good light of the day, and it was enough. It was more than enough.